Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the life of Peter. And I have composed myself from our last session together, thankfully. And we're going to look at another one of those episodes where Peter, James, and John are the only ones with Jesus. And we're in Matthew chapter 17, the Mount of Transfiguration, a moment also recorded by the other gospel writers, by the writers of the synoptic gospels. Anyway, we're in Matthew 17, and so um, Matthew connects this event with both the confession of Peter and Jesus saying, "Get behind me, Satan." And it makes sense that this would have happened about that time because they are already far north, and Jesus is in the north, and he's in a very high mountain. And the mountain that he's on, some people want to make this uh, um, Mount, different mounts, but this is probably Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon in Palestine is the tallest mountain. It's right at around 10,000 feet. It is snow-capped even to this day during global warming, and it would have been snowy probably two-thirds of the way up the mountain starting. And if they're high on this mountain, the events in 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 Matthew chapter 17 could be happening in the snow, which is a cool thing to imagine, especially with all the whiteness that is going on in the story. Um, and it's an important moment for the apostles. It's an important moment for Jesus, and it's one of those three times. There are three times when God speaks out from heaven and says something about Jesus, so that others can see. There's there's his baptism, the Mount of Transfiguration, and then later, um, whenever the Gentiles are brought to Jesus, and he makes his statement after that happens in John's gospel. And so we're here in Matthew 17 in this middle time that this happens. It's not long before Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem. This is towards the end of Jesus' ministry. And I think this is important not only for the apostles, but very important for Jesus himself. So let's read this. 6 days later, Jesus took, that's 6 days later. I mean, that's a timestamp. It's not just at some point. That's why I think this is happening immediately following the events surrounding Peter's confession. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother. Again, John, his brother, James is mentioned first, brought them up to a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, his garments became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for you to be here. If you wish, I will make three tabernacles, three lean-tos, three, sheds. I'll get branches together and make three little cabines, three places of worship here. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were much afraid. And Jesus came to them and touched them and said, Arise, do not be afraid. And lifting up their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. And they were coming down from the mountains, Jesus commanded them, saying, Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. And his disciples asked him, saying, Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he answered and said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. But I say that Elijah has already come. And they didn't recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished. So the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands in the same way. And the disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. This is so cool and so vivid. Um, So they're on Mount Hermon, maybe in the snow, and something happens to Jesus, and he's transformed, and he radiates light. He just radiates light. His face radiates light. His body radiates light. He is a figure of light, a being of light at this point. Um, to me, Jesus has given something back, something that he emptied of himself, as Paul will say in Philippians 2, to come to earth. He's given a moment of something of himself back, something of who he was before he came to earth. He's given something back of that. How important was that to him? And he's talking to Moses and Elijah, and they're talking back and forth. Would that we knew what they were talking about. But Moses and Elijah are significant. They represent the law and the prophets. And I know that Moses is also a prophet, but in the gathering together of the Old Testament, in the thinking of the biblical text, Jesus and his contemporaries thought of the law and the prophets, and the law being what Moses delivered to us, and Elijah being the first of the called prophets, someone who is actually about the business of being a prophet, not just leading a nation or leading a people out of captivity, but whose sole purpose is to be a prophet and to fulfill the prophetic office. He's the first. So we have the law and the prophets. And that phrase, law and the prophets, means all of inspired scripture that the Jews have at their disposal. And so that's important. There is the sense of this is being fulfilled. There's a transition. Something is moving. We're moving from one thing to another thing. We're moving from one age to another age, one era to another era. But there are so many things these guys have in common. Their works were so difficult, all three of them. And they were about the business of trying to herd cats, almost all the time. So frustrating that people just wouldn't get what was so clear about God, and they were dealing with it all the time. So there's that. There's the fact that all of their deaths were singularities, or their ends were all singularities. No one was with Moses when he died but God, and God himself buried Moses. Elijah did not see death at all, but was himself transformed, translated into heaven in a pillar of fire and accompanied by, the fire, the flaming chariot, and did not see death. So his passing was a singularity. And of course, Jesus was raised from the dead, given a resurrection body here, and then taken to heaven. That's not happened to anybody else, not yet, anyway. And then that resurrection body, as Paul describes in Philippians 2, is glorified. And this also connects with what John experiences in Revelation 1, seeing the glorified resurrection body of Jesus and his senses being unable to process it and falling down as dead and having Jesus come behind him and touch him and bring him to life again. So we have all that connected. It's also interesting that all three men fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Moses when he was on the Mount Sinai, Elijah when he was headed to Mount Sinai to have his conversation with Jesus, with God, and Jesus when he was being tempted by the devil in the wilderness. There's just a lot of connections between. But Peter is the one who speaks up. Peter is the one who opens his mouth, thinks he's saying the right thing, and is saying the absolute wrong thing. And before he gets finished speaking, God interrupts and says, No, no, you're not getting this. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. He said that at Jesus' baptism. And then he adds the phrase, listen to him. Listen to him. This is important because in Hebrew, there isn't a word that means obey. There's a phrase, Shema Bakol, to hear the voice. To listen means to obey. Not the law and the prophets anymore, not the Old Testament. They're to lead us to my Son. My Son is now my message. My Son is the one you listen to. My Son is the one you obey at this point. And then Jesus helps him unpack that on the way down the mountain. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me for what is, again, nearly 10 good minutes with the Word. We're going to move forward to the Last Supper. We have so much to cover in Peter's life. We could do the entire ministry of Jesus because Peter was there for it. We're not doing that. We want to go to John 13 and what happens at the Last Supper. And then we're going to look at Peter in those events in that the last day or so and at the resurrection, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, before we move on to the leadership role that he plays in the book of Acts. Thank you for joining me for what is now nearly 11 good minutes with the Word.